My friend recently received a request to make a video showing how he uses PluginGuru's Unify with Ableton Live via an Android tablet. As my friend has a face for radio and a mouth full of marbles, he's asked me to help. Having had an evolving studio setup for many years, the ever-increasing complexity of its design and operation led to a diminishing return in music production, as most of the time was spent configuring hardware and software, rather than making music. Something needed to change. So, despite being a 10-thumbed, tone-deaf, talentless noise polluter, it was agreed to buy a digital grand piano and plonk it slap bang in the living room, where it would be accepted by all, as part of the furniture. The challenge was now clear: retain as much functionality, sound reproduction, and recording capability as provided by the dedicated studio setup, but all to be made accessible by the use of a grand piano keyboard and a single Android tablet. If the tablet could have only one control screen, and the ability to have the piano ready to play with a single press of its power button, that would be the ultimate goal. In technical terms, the person at the piano should have immediate access to an entire library of VST plugin patches, with up to 8 independently controllable layers within each patch, at least 16 available effect controls, and a minimum of 8 Ableton Live recording tracks. As such, the player can both live perform and track or song record, all from a single screen. Obviously, this setup requires a main computer to do most of the work. In this case, it's a modestly spec'd Windows 11 desktop PC, which is hidden away in a side cabinet. The PC has a fully automated loading sequence after powering on, during which time Windows 11 loads, followed by the Touchable Pro server app, then Ableton Live, along with all associated instances of Unify, and all previously saved patch selections and settings. Both the standalone version of Unify and VST version make use of a Unify setup script. This defines the CC number for each Unify macro control knob, as well as the number of controls per screen, and total number of controls per patch. The standalone version can then link these assigned CC knobs to a selection of Unify parameters, using a second MIDI configuration script. Both setup scripts are simply text files, which can easily be updated in a text editor. It is recommended to always make a backup first, so you can return to your previous setup if things go wrong. Meanwhile, the Ableton setup requires each patch to incorporate something called a macro definitions template. This template takes care of assigning Unify's MIDI control knobs to a specific set of Unify parameters. These parameters can either be linked using Unify's drop-down menus, or via the recently introduced Magic Ears function, which is available in the latest version of Unify. Once defined, the Touchable Pro screen could be designed. Whilst Touchable Pro was designed specifically to control most aspects of Ableton Live without the need for a mouse or keyboard, its built-in template designer can also be used to send MIDI control codes, without the need for Ableton to be running. As such, the same screen once designed, can also be used with the standalone version of Unify. With so many layout possibilities, it's not surprising that designing a new screen can be quite an evolving process. Whilst functionality is important, the screen has to be both comfortable to use, intuitive to control, and fast to respond. The central part of the screen controls Unify's core patch parameters, with individual control being provided for up to 8 layers. Each layer can be enabled and disabled, which results in any inbound MIDI information being ignored by that layer. The next row of controls are linked to the direct send level for each layer. This bypasses any effects processing included in the patch. Conversely, the auxiliary sends are linked to the effect layer. Most patches will typically have just one effect send per layer, but a patch with more than one effect send could easily be added. It is important to stress that, in this setup, the single control screen limitation is a user preference, and not a technical limitation. Meanwhile, Solo isolates a single layer, whilst silencing all remaining layers. Finally, Mute silences a layer, without affecting the other layers. The pan controls adjust the left and right balance of the mix level output. The final linked parameter for each layer is the mix level. So far, all of these mapped controls are completely independent of patch. As such, their function remains unchanged, irrespective of which Unify patch has been loaded. The only difference will be the number of layers a patch contains. If a patch only contains a single layer, then only the first column of controls will work on the touchscreen. The record and stop buttons provide direct access to Ableton's transport controls. Unify library patches can be auditioned, either by using the next and previous buttons, or the random button where a patch is loaded at random from within the selected Unify library. The remaining 2 rows of knobs work independently of the macro parameters template. Whilst each of these 16 control knobs remain linked to Unify, the parameter each knob controls changes with each patch. These VST instrument and effect parameters are pre-programmed by the patch creator. Because the Unify macro knobs remain linked to Touchable, the user has immediate access to these 16 patch-specific parameters via these 2 rows of controls. Last, but certainly not least, is a master volume level. This adjusts the volume output of the multi-patch, and affects all volume layers within that patch, uniformly. For the purposes of this short demonstration, the same Android tablet was used to run an app called TeamViewer, which allows the user to both view and control the host Windows PC, without the need for an additional monitor, keyboard or mouse. In order to be able to control, play, and record each layer of Unify independently, a MIDI track was created with a single instance of Unify loaded into it. 8 further MIDI tracks were created, but left empty, so their outputs could be assigned to the Unify track, and more importantly, a specific input channel between 1 and 16. As the Unify instance has an 8-layer multi-patch loaded for the purposes of this demonstration, each of the 8 layers was set to receive MIDI on channels 1 through 8 respectively. By having one dedicated Ableton MIDI track per Unify layer, each layer can now be played, recorded, and controlled, completely independently of each other. The touchscreen includes session and arrangement recording buttons, as well as scene selection buttons for moving between groups of 8 session clips at a time. Whichever tracks are armed, result in the receiving Unify layer being recorded during both session and arrangement recording. Arming one or more layers during playback of a recording allows for live playing of those layers without affecting the recording playback. For example, if all 8 layers feature in either an 8-clip scene or arrangement recording, only arming layer 1 for live playback does not affect the other 7 layers from playing back as originally recorded. With Ableton's overdub facility, this provides a great live looping setup. For more complex setups, 4 instances of Unify, together with 4 groups of 8 channel-assigned tracks, could be set up. This would provide 32 independent tracks, with each instance of Unify being controlled by a dedicated controller screen. It is important to remember that even with an 8-layer setup, Unify can use nested multi-patches, where each patch is actually another multi-layer of Unify patches. So, that concludes the setup and controller overview. The only thing remaining is to see and hear the touchable Unify controller in action.